They called him dangerous now, but once he was the reason a child made it out of the fire alive. Chained to a rotting post behind a forgotten shelter, he waited as the world passed him by. As his name was stripped away, as memories of what he had done slowly sank into the mud along with everything else they didn't want to face. No one remembered the nights he stood between fear and safety, the times his instincts saved lives while others froze. To them, he was just another broken creature, unworthy of a second look. But fate has a strange way of circling back, and when one boy, carrying his own invisible scars, stepped into that battered place, two shattered souls found each other across a gap wider than years. This isn't just the story of a rescue. It's a story of a loyalty too fierce to die, a bond too deep to be forgotten, and a love that defies everything it's told it cannot survive. If you believe some connections are meant to find their way home, no matter what, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. We'd be honored to hear your story too. It was supposed to be just another rainy afternoon at the edge of town, where the broken-down shelter stood tucked between abandoned factories and weedy lots. Nathan held his mother's hand loosely as they walked through the heavy steel doors, the overwhelming smell of wet concrete and disinfectant hitting him like a slap. He didn't even want to be there. His mother thought getting a pet might help with the hollow ache he carried since his father's death. But Nathan wasn't looking for a dog. What he missed was the steady, reassuring presence of someone who understood without words. The shelter was noisy, chaotic, the endless chorus of barking bouncing off the walls. Volunteers moved through the aisles with leashes and cleaning buckets, barely glancing at the newcomers. Nathan kept his head down, his sneakers squeaking on the slick floor. His mother squeezed his hand. "Just look around," she said, voice bright in that fake way adults use when they're trying to. Nathan let go and drifted through the rows. Cages lined both sides, filled with restless movement. Golden retrievers pacing, pit bulls throwing themselves at the bars, terriers trembling in the corners. But Nathan felt detached, like he was underwater, sound muted, colors too sharp. He kept walking, not really seeing, until something shifted in the air. He stopped. In a far corner, half hidden by a stack of broken crates, sat a dog so still he seemed sculpted from the gloom itself. A German shepherd, large but gaunt, his fur dulled by months of neglect. The dog didn't bark, didn't move. He simply watched. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, Nathan forgot how to breathe. The boy stepped closer. A volunteer noticed and hurried over. "Oh, that's Amos," she said, her voice dipping low. "Poor boy's been here 6 months, barely eats, doesn't react too much anymore." Nathan crouched carefully outside the cage. He didn't call out or reach through the bars. He just sat there, still, patient, the way his father had taught him to wait for a frightened animal to make the first move. Minutes stretched. Around them, the world buzzed and barked and rushed. But Nathan and Amos remained in their small, suspended bubble. Then, almost imperceptibly, Amos shifted. Slowly, he sat up straighter, his ears flickering forward. And then, astonishingly, he did something no one had seen in months. Amos lifted his paw in a stiff, deliberate salute. Not a trick for treats, not a desperate plea, but something deeper, instinctual. Nathan's breath caught. He remembered that gesture. It had been part of his father's old therapy dog training sessions, something they'd done together after Dad came back from the hospital bars. Amos stared at him, intense and unblinking. Behind them, Nathan's mother watched with wide eyes. A volunteer murmured, "That's Kip." The shelter director came over, frowning. "We were about to transfer him out," she said softly. "He hasn't connected with anyone." But now the dog was trembling subtly, not with fear, but with barely contained energy. A trembling that seemed to build from the tips of his paws to his battered ears. Nathan's hands stayed steady. His heart, however, slammed so hard against his ribs, he thought it might crack them. He didn't know what this meant, not yet. But deep in his gut, he knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. He couldn't leave without Amos. His mother approached slowly. "Nathan," she began, but he cut her off with a whisper. "He's waiting for me." The words felt ancient, bigger than the moment, as if they belonged to a story that had stepped into this shelter. The director shook her head slightly. "You don't understand, kid. He's been broken, you can't just..." But Nathan, for the first time in months, stood tall. "Please," he said, "let me try." The director hesitated. Maybe it was the look in Nathan's eyes, a look so painfully earnest it cracked her professional detachment. Maybe it was the subtle way Amos inched closer, pressing his weight against the inside of the bars like he was leaning toward a memory he couldn't quite touch. Whatever it was, she finally sighed and unlocked the cage. Amos stepped out. He didn't bolt. He didn't cower. He walked straight to Nathan and sat, lifting his head proudly as if presenting himself for duty. Nathan knelt. He pressed his forehead gently against the dog's. Amos stayed perfectly still, his breathing slow and steady. A low, soft whine vibrated through his chest, not fear, not pain, but recognition. Behind them, the rest of the shelter seemed to blur, the clamor fading into white noise. There was only the boy and the broken dog, two lonely souls finding, somehow, a piece of home in each other. That was how it began, with rain slicking the parking lot, with a mother watching silently from the shadows, and with two hearts battered by loss choosing against all odds to trust again. The rain was still coming down when Nathan and his mother signed the temporary foster papers. Amos sat close, pressing his side lightly against Nathan's leg, as if anchoring them both to the slippery floor of reality. Volunteers buzzed around them, filling out forms, leashing other dogs, oblivious to the small miracle unfolding at Cage 42. Shelter director, a woman named Ms. Holloway, observed quietly. Her brow furrowed as if an itch she couldn't scratch had begun troubling her mind. After the paperwork, Ms. Holloway excused herself and disappeared into the back office, a cramped space overstuffed with filing cabinets and yellowed forms. Something about Amos's sudden reaction, the unprecedented connection with Nathan, had unsettled her professional instincts. She prided herself on understanding trauma cases, but this felt like more than just coincidence. Amos had been a ghost for months, retreating further into himself with each passing day, immune to treats, toys, gentle voices. Yet here he was, tail flicking in cautious hope, resting a battered head against a boy who had simply walked in out of the rain. Madame Holloway flipped through the intake records, searching for anything that might explain this transformation. She found the basics easily enough. Amos, male German Shepherd, approximately 5 years old, transferred from a closed rehabilitation center outside of town. Listed as aggressive, unsuitable for adoption without extensive retraining. There were old notes too, paces at night, unresponsive to standard command. But tucked between the pages, nearly missed, was a faded blue folder marked only with the words "Protocol," but given by the sentiment agent had bared of his Archie. Curious, she pulled it free. Inside were photographs, printouts, and logs, fragments of a life Amos had once lived. Her breath caught as she sifted through them. Here was Amos younger, his coat gleaming, his eyes alert and intelligent, sitting patiently in a bright therapy room decorated with crayon drawings and low tables. Beside him, in many of the photos, were children, most blurred with motion or half-turned from the camera. But in one image, front and center, a boy sat cross-legged on the mat, laughing unabashedly as Amos gently rested a paw in his lap. Meldum Caswell leaned in, squinting at the name printed on the back of the photo in shaky block letters. Nathan. Emma chill ran down her spine. She flipped through accompanying notes. Session logs detailed interaction after interaction between Amos and a young participant named Nathan Matthews. The dates lined up exactly 5 years ago. According to the program reports, Nathan had been enrolled following a traumatic event, the loss of a parent in a vehicular accident, and had shown remarkable progress during weekly therapy sessions with Amos as his primary animal companion. Further down, another notation made her pause. Program discontinued after incident. See Incident Report 17A. Heart pounding, she dug through the folders until she found the incident file, thin but heavy with consequence. The report was brief. A fire had broken out in the rehab facility during a severe storm, electrical faults cited. Staff evacuated quickly, but in the confusion, the therapy animals had been left locked in their enclosures. Amos had reportedly resisted handlers trying to move him, instead pacing frantically by the children's wing exit. By the time emergency responders arrived, several therapy dogs had perished. Amos had been found alive but severely traumatized, curled in the burnt remains of the play area, refusing to leave. Staff later attributed his psychological decline to the cumulative loss and trauma of that night. Ms. Holloway sat back in her chair, stunned. She glanced toward the front of the shelter where Nathan knelt on the damp floor, fastening a collar around Amos's neck. They moved like old soldiers recognizing each other after years apart, bound by something no one else in the room could feel. It was impossible, improbable beyond reason, and yet the evidence lay there in her hands. This Nathan was the same Nathan. He had been a child under Amos's care once, wrapped in the healing rhythm of simple games, guided by a dog's steadfast presence. Somehow, despite years and sorrow and broken pathways, fate or something deeper had led them back together. Miss Holloway hesitated for a long moment before making a decision she rarely allowed herself. She would not tell them yet. Some bonds, some rediscoveries needed to unfold in their own time. She would monitor closely, of course, but she sensed that interference could shatter the delicate bridge slowly rebuilding itself between boy and dog. Meanwhile, Nathan walked Amos toward the exit, the dog pacing cautiously beside him, head low but ears pricked. Nathan glanced up at his mother, silently pleading for her patience. She gave a tight, unsure smile and opened the car door. Amos hesitated only a second before jumping inside, curling into a tight ball on the seat, as if afraid this small slice of peace would be taken away. As they drove through the rain-slicked streets, Nathan stared out the window, his hand resting on Amos's trembling flank. He didn't understand why the dog's presence felt so startlingly familiar, why it seemed to fill a space inside him he hadn't even realized was hollow until that moment. In the back of Nathan's mind, old memories stirred half-formed images of laughter in bright rooms, of fur beneath his small fingers, of a steadfast warmth anchoring him through tides of fear. He closed his eyes and let the images come, fragmented but powerful. There had been a game, he was sure of it, a simple tapping rhythm he had taught a dog once, a dog that had become the axis of his small broken world. Amos shifted in the seat beside him, letting out a deep, exhausted sigh, and Nathan opened his eyes. The rain had eased into mist now, the city blurring into a smear of gray and gold outside the window. Nathan's mother made a quiet turn toward home, her knuckles white around the steering wheel. No one spoke. The air between them thrummed with unspoken things: fear, hope, grief and something new, fragile, grief and something new, fragile, grief and something new, fragile. In the shelter, Miss Holloway returned the blue folder carefully to the cabinet, locking it away again. She leaned against the cold metal, staring at the door through which boy and dog had disappeared, a lump forming in her throat. Sometimes, she thought, the universe stitched its own wounds in silence, without asking permission or explaining the scars it left behind. In the car, Nathan reached into the side pocket of his backpack, pulling free an old, frayed friendship bracelet he had worn as a child, tucked away all these years like a talisman against forgetting. He didn't know why he brought it today. Maybe deep down he had known this was not going to be an ordinary day. He slipped the bracelet onto Amos's paw. The dog shifted slightly but didn't resist. Nathan smiled, a small thing, raw, and somewhere inside him, without understanding how or why, Nathan Matthews began to remember. The car rolled to a gentle stop in front of their house, an aging two-story wrapped in creeping ivy, and half drowned in the mist of the fading rain. Nathan opened the back door and waited, heart thumping with a nervous rhythm he didn't quite understand. Amos hesitated at first, his paws hovering just above the threshold of the unknown. But then he leapt down, his movements stiff but determined. Nathan led him carefully up the porch steps, his mother unlocking the door with a trembling hand. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and laundry detergent, and something faintly floral, the lingering trace of his father's aftershave that his mother refused to throw away. Amos padded across the worn hardwood floor, his nails clicking lightly with each cautious step. Nathan shrugged off his raincoat and bent down to unclip the leash. But Amos didn't bolt away as some dogs might after confinement. Instead, he stayed close, circling Nathan once before settling heavily by the boy's side. Nathan reached out hesitantly, brushing the back of his hand along Amos's battered fur, feeling the rough texture of old scars and the deep heat radiating from the dog's body. A small tremor passed through Amos, but he didn't flinch or pull away. Encouraged, Nathan sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing Amos closer with a quiet murmur. Without warning, Amos leaned forward, his wet nose nuzzling insistently at Nathan's left wrist. Nathan chuckled softly, amused and a little embarrassed, until Amos's tongue darted out, warm and careful, and licked a small jagged scar near the inside of Nathan's wrist. The smile faded from Nathan's face, replaced by a startled, hollowed-out kind of wonder. It was the scar from years ago, from the surgery after the accident that had taken his father's life and nearly his own. Nathan remembered the hospital rooms and the endless beeping of machines, the feel of bandages too tight around his skin, the way he had hated the way everyone looked at him with pity, with fear, with forced smiles. No one had ever touched that scar the way Amos just did. Not even his mother. Nathan swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden sting of tears. Amos pulled back slightly, his deep brown eyes steady, unblinking, as if reassuring him. "I know you, I remember. You are not alone." Nathan raised his wrist, letting Amos sniff it again, and the dog responded by laying his heavy head gently against the boy's forearm. A silent promise etched in the quiet between them. Nathan's mother stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand covering her mouth, unsure whether to intrude or let the sacredness of the moment unfold untouched. Nathan didn't notice her. His entire world had shrunk to the warmth of fur against skin, the weight of silent recognition heavier than any words could ever be. Later that evening, after a rushed dinner Nathan barely touched, he brought Amos upstairs to his bedroom. It was a small space crowded with books and posters and a lopsided dresser Nathan had stubbornly insisted on keeping, even after one leg cracked and had to be braced with a stack of old textbooks. Amos sniffed around briefly, then settled in the corner nearest Nathan's bed, curling himself into a tight spiral as if preparing for a long vigil. Nathan sat on the edge of his bed, one foot absently tapping the floor in a pattern he hadn't realized he was making. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. It was a pattern from long ago, from therapy sessions when words had felt too big and scary to use, and instead, he communicated through games of knock-knock rhythms, simple and soothing. Amos's ears twitched at the sound, and he lifted his head slightly, eyes sharpening with an alertness Nathan hadn't seen earlier. Heart pounding, Nathan repeated the rhythm tap-tap pause. Tap-tap. Amos rose to his feet slowly, approached and pressed his paw once, twice, 3 times against the side of the bed frame. Pause, and then tapped twice more. Nathan gasped audibly, his hands flying to cover his mouth as if to trap the sob, threatening to burst. The house around them seemed to hold its breath, the walls leaning in closer to hear, the floor trembling with the echo of old, buried memories clawing their way back to the surface. Nathan knelt down, pressing his forehead to Amos, his fingers digging into the dog's thick fur, anchoring himself to something real in a world that had felt so slippery and cruel for so long. He whispered the old signal from years past, the one he'd invented when he was too shy to call Amos by name in public. A soft series of hums and taps only Amos would understand. The dog's tail thumped once, twice, against the floor in recognition. The next morning, as sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, Nathan prepared for school reluctantly. Part of him didn't want to leave Amos alone, afraid that the fragile thread binding them might fray if stretched too thin. His mother assured him they would only be apart for a few hours, that Amos would still be there when he got back. Nathan wasn't so sure. He bent to hug the dog tightly before he left, pressing his face into the warm, musky scent of fur that now felt more like home than anything else. At the door, he hesitated, glancing back one last time. Amos sat by the front window, ears pricked forward, tail curled neatly around his paws. Nathan tapped the doorframe lightly 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. Amos lifted his paw and swiped it across the floor in the exact same rhythm. Nathan smiled, a fierce, aching thing at his long tail hazard at his body tense with longing. When Nathan was halfway down the street, Amos rose, padded to the front door, and placed both paws gently against it. Then he dragged his claws down in that same 3-2 pattern. Again and again, the sound soft and insistent like a heartbeat refusing to be forgotten. Inside his backpack, tucked between battered textbooks and half-finished homework assignments, Nathan carried a crumpled photo he had found that morning at the bottom of a box in his closet. It showed a younger version of himself, grinning shyly, sitting cross-legged in a brightly colored room, one hand resting on the thick, proud neck of a German shepherd. No caption, no date, just a moment captured in time when the world had still felt repairable. Nathan didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know why fate had twisted back on itself to bring him and Amos together again after so many lost years. But as he walked toward the horizon where the mist still clung stubbornly to the earth, he knew one thing with the absolute certainty that only children and the broken-hearted can muster. Some bonds do not dissolve. They only sleep, waiting for the right moment to rise. The rest of the day dragged for Nathan, each tick of the classroom clock pounding louder than the last, each lesson a blur of meaningless noise. His mind kept drifting back to Amos, to the soft weight of the dog's head against his chest, to the slow, deliberate tap-tap pop. When the final bell rang, Nathan bolted out of his seat, ignoring the shouted reminders about homework and upcoming tests, his feet barely touching the ground as he sprinted home. He burst through the front door, dropping his backpack unceremoniously in the hallway, and called out before he even saw her, "Mom, we have to adopt him, I mean it, we have to." But he stopped short when he found her standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, face pinched tight in that way she had when trying not to cry. Amos sat at her feet, tail thumping hesitantly against the linoleum, head tilted slightly as if sensing the storm brewing between mother and son. Nathan rushed forward. "Please, Mom, just listen. He knows me, it's not just me imagining things, it's like we were meant to find each other again." His words tumbled over each other in a desperate torrent. His mother took a slow breath, her fingers tightening against her elbows. "Nathan, I know you feel connected to him, I see it. But this isn't some fairy tale. He's broken, maybe too broken. Dogs like that, they don't always recover." Dark fingers flicked against. She cut herself off, the unspoken fear sharp in the space between them. "I don't want you to get hurt," she finished in a whisper. Nathan shook his head violently. "He would never hurt me, never." He dropped to his knees beside Amos, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. Amos leaned into him, his body warm and solid, the low hum of his breathing grounding Nathan's spiraling panic. "He remembers me," Nathan said fiercely. "And I remember him. Maybe not everything yet, but it's there. I can feel it." His mother watched them, her eyes glistening. For a moment, it looked like she might crumble, might cave to the raw sincerity in her son's voice. But then she shook her head again, slower this time, the weight of adult fears too heavy to set aside so easily. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, her voice cracking. "We'll foster him for a little while, we'll help him, but we can't." She hesitated, struggling for the right words. Nathan lowered his gaze, swallowing the hot, bitter lump rising in his throat. He nodded stiffly. "Okay," he said, "foster." But in his heart the word twisted into something fierce and determined. Not temporary, not conditional. He would make her see, he would show her that some broken things weren't meant to be thrown away. That night, after Amos had eaten his fill and curled up at the foot of Nathan's bed, Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind churned through plans, arguments, desperate bargains he could offer to change his mother's mind. The rhythmic sound of Amos's breathing soothed him, but it also made the ache sharper, more urgent. He couldn't lose him again. Not now. Not when they had found each other across all the lost years and silent miles. He drifted into a restless sleep just before dawn. Dreams tangled with flashes of memories, bright playrooms, the scent of peanut butter treats, a rough tongue licking away his childhood tears. Morning brought no clarity, only exhaustion. Nathan dragged himself through breakfast, his mother watching him with wary, worried eyes. Neither of them spoke about the looming decision hanging over them, as heavy and inevitable as a gathering storm. The knock at the door came just as Nathan was tying his shoelaces, the sudden sound sharp and jarring in the heavy morning stillness. His mother frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and crossed to the door. Nathan followed, a strange fluttering in his chest. No one ever visited this early. When she opened the door, no one stood there. Only a plain, cream-colored envelope lay on the doormat, the flap unsealed, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Nathan's mother hesitated, then bent to pick it up. Her name was written across the front in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. Helen Matthews, no return address. No postage stamp, as if it had been placed there by hand. She turned it over once, twice, then slipped a trembling finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Nathan watched her face as she read. He saw the color drain from her cheeks, the way her mouth opened and closed without sound, the way her hands tightened against the letter, as if trying to hold herself together by sheer force. "Mom?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She blinked once, twice, and held out the letter to him with a hand that shook slightly. Nathan took it and began to read. "Dear Mrs. Matthews, you don't know me, but years ago I was part of the animal-assisted therapy program your son participated in. I was one of the staff psychologists assigned to monitor the interactions between children and therapy animals. I remember Nathan vividly. I remember the way he and Amos connected, almost instantly, almost impossibly. We used to joke that they were two parts of the same soul. I am writing now because I have learned through old contacts that Amos has somehow found his way back into your lives. I cannot pretend to understand the forces that led to this, but I know, with all the certainty of my profession and my heart, that their bond was rare, healing, sacred. I know what Amos suffered after the fire. I know what Nathan endured. And I know that separating them again would be a cruelty neither of them deserves. Please, I urge you, let them stay together. They need each other in ways that no one else can quite fill. You may doubt it now, but I have seen it with my own eyes. They saved each other once. They can do. Sincerely, Dr. Elizabeth Rowe." Nathan finished reading and looked up at his mother, his heart hammering so hard he could barely hear past the rush of blood in his ears. Her eyes were wide, stunned, vulnerable in a way he had rarely seen. She looked at him, then at Amos, who had padded over to sit quietly at Nathan's side, his large, solemn eyes steady and sure. For a long moment, the three of them stood frozen in that small, sunlit entryway, the world outside muffled and distant, the letter trembling between them like a bridge too fragile to trust. Nathan opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, his mother turned abruptly and walked into the living room, clutching the letter against her chest. The decision, when it came, was not announced with fanfare or heavy words. Nathan's mother simply returned to the kitchen, pulled Amos's adoption paperwork from the counter, and signed it with a hand that trembled only slightly. She said nothing as she slid the papers back into Nathan's waiting hands, but the look in her eyes, full of fear, hope, and surrender, was louder than any speech. Nathan hugged her fiercely, whispering a thank you against her shoulder before dashing to find Amos, who waited patiently by the stairs, tail thudding a slow, steady rhythm against the wall. That afternoon, Nathan and Amos moved into the house not as temporary guests, but as something more permanent, though none of them dared to say the word aloud. As soon as Nathan unclipped the leash, Amos took 2 cautious steps into the living room, sniffed the air, then, without hesitation, turned toward the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. Nathan and his mother watched, frozen in place, as Amos moved with purpose, ignoring the kitchen, the living room, the stairs to the basement. His nails clicked lightly on the hard wood, a steady cadence that echoed down the silent hall. He paused briefly at the threshold of Nathan's room, nose twitching, ears perked forward, then pushed the door open with his broad muzzle and disappeared inside. Nathan followed, heart pounding with a strange mixture of awe and fear. Inside, Amos circled once, twice, then settled heavily in the far corner of the room. Facing the bed, his back straight, his eyes steady. He looked as though he had been guarding that spot his entire life, as if he had simply returned to his post after an inexplicable, aching absence. Nathan's throat tightened painfully. He knelt by Amos, running his hands slowly over the dog's scarred back, and whispered, "You." Amos didn't move, but his deep, steady breathing was answer enough. Nathan's mother lingered in the doorway for a moment longer before retreating down the hall, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. She left them alone, sensing that whatever was unfolding between boy and dog was not something she could or should interrupt. Nathan spent the evening with Amos at his side, pulling dusty boxes out from under the bed, digging through childhood relics he had long since stopped believing mattered. Old action figures, broken crayons, crumpled notebooks filled with shaky handwriting. In one battered shoebox, tucked between a fraying friendship bracelet and a bent paper star, he found a laminated badge with faded block letters, "Junior Therapy Partner Nathan Matthews." Nathan traced the edges of the badge with his thumb, memories crowding closer, pressing against the thin walls he had spent years building. He slid the badge into his pocket and lay back on the bed, Amos curling up on the floor beside him with a heavy sigh. The night deepened, shadows lengthening across the room, as the house fell into a hush broken only by the occasional creak of old wood settling into sleep. Nathan drifted between dreams and waking, his mind a jumbled tangle of images and sounds he couldn't quite sort. Somewhere around midnight, the old house groaned under the weight of a shifting wind, and Amos stirred. His ears twitched, his nose lifted, and he rose silently to his feet. Nathan, half asleep, cracked open an eye and watched as Amos padded quietly toward the door. Posture tense but focused. He watched, heart hammering, as Amos settled himself directly in front of the door, his body stretched out in a protective line across the threshold. Amos lowered his head onto his paws, eyes facing outward into the darkness of the hallway, and did not move again. Nathan's chest ached with a mixture of fierce love and piercing sadness. He wanted to call Amos back to the bed, to pull him close and bury his face in that warm, solid body. But he didn't. Some instincts he understood even now were older than words, older than comfort. Amos was keeping watch just as he had once before, in another place, another lifetime. The hours dragged by in a blur of restless sleep, Nathan waking at intervals to the soft scrape of claws against wood, the low rumble of a protective growl at some imagined threat. Each time he found Amos still at his post, unwavering. It was only in the deepest, most silent hours of the night that something changed. Nathan woke to the faint sound of terror. He sat up slowly, blinking into the gloom, and saw Amos standing on his hind legs, front paws braced against the wall where an old photograph hung slightly askew. The picture was one of the few decorations left untouched since his father's death. A photo he had long ago stopped really seeing, himself as a toddler, perched on his father's knee, both of them grinning at something just out of frame. Nathan's mother had insisted on keeping it there, a memorial. Now Amos was clawing at it with single-minded intensity, his teeth bared, his body tense with a strange urgency. Nathan scrambled out of bed, heart racing. "Amos, no," he hissed, but the dog ignored him. With one final savage tug, Amos yanked the photo from the wall. The glass shattered on the hardwood floor, the frame splintering into jagged shards. Nathan stumbled forward, catching Amos by the collar, but froze when he saw what the dog had revealed. Beneath the photograph, taped haphazardly to the wall, was another picture, one he had forgotten. It was a candid shot, snapped at some long-forgotten therapy session. Nathan sat cross-legged on a colorful mat, laughing, while a sleek young German shepherd rested its chin on his knee, gazing up at him with an expression of absolute, unbreakable devotion. The same devotion Nathan now saw mirrored in Amos's scarred, battered face. Nathan dropped to his knees, brushing aside the broken glass carefully with one hand, and lifted the second photograph from where it had fallen. The edges were curled, the colors faded, but the connection blazed as bright and fierce as if no time had passed at all. Amos whined softly, nudging Nathan's hand with his nose, and Nathan buried his face in the dog's thick ruff, tears spilling hot and unbidden down his cheeks. He had buried so much, locked away so many pieces of himself in the dusty attic of memory, too afraid to confront the pain, too young to know how to carry it. And Amos had waited all this time, not just surviving but holding on to the threads of a bond neither of them had been ready to let die. Nathan sat there for a long time, cradling the old photograph, Amos's weight steady against his side, the broken pieces of glass glinting around them like the remnants of a shattered world slowly, painfully, beginning to knit itself back together. The days that followed blurred into a strange kind of rhythm, as if the house itself had shifted its heartbeat to accommodate the boy and the dog locked in their delicate, silent dance of healing. Nathan, once so prone to vanishing into the dark corners of his room, found himself coaxed into the light by forces he barely understood. It began subtly, small changes at first that might have gone unnoticed if he hadn't already been watching Amos so closely, studying the dog with the desperate attentiveness of someone afraid of losing something precious all over again. One morning, Nathan awoke to find his sneakers usually tossed carelessly under the bed, placed neatly by the door. He blinked at them groggily, then at Amos, who sat nearby, his tail giving one slow sweep across the floor, as if to say, Nathan didn't think much of it until it happened again the next morning, and again the morning after that. Each time, the sneakers were placed precisely in the same spot, side by side, laces untangled, as if awaiting a journey. Then came the jump rope. It had been stuffed in the bottom drawer of Nathan's dresser for years, forgotten like so many relics of a childhood interrupted too soon. Yet one afternoon, returning from school, Nathan found it laid carefully across his pillow, the frayed handles arranged so they pointed toward the door. Amos sat nearby, watching him with that same patient intensity, as if urging him to remember, to move, to live. At first, Nathan resisted. He left the sneakers untouched, ignored the jump rope, retreated into his fortress of silence and shadows. But Amos was relentless. Every morning, the shoes reappeared by the door. Every afternoon, the jump rope waited on the bed. And always, Amos sat close, not judging, not pushing, just waiting with a steady, unbreakable kind of hope. Finally, one Saturday morning, Nathan gave in. He slipped on the sneakers, tied the laces with clumsy fingers, grabbed the jump rope and opened the front door to a world washed clean by early autumn rain. Amos bounded ahead, stopping just at the edge of the porch, tail wagging in slow, measured arcs. Nathan followed, stepping onto the damp grass, the chill air biting at his cheeks. He started to skip, slowly at first, the rope slapping against the ground in awkward, stuttering rhythm. Amos barked once, sharply, a sound so full of encouragement that Nathan couldn't help but laugh. A rusty, broken sound that cracked open something inside him. He skipped faster, his body remembering the old patterns even as his heart struggled to catch up. Amos raced alongside him, matching his pace, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, joyful pride. Nathan collapsed onto the grass after only a few minutes, breathless and dizzy, but smiling so hard his cheeks ached. Amos flopped down beside him, his tongue lolling out, and together they lay under the pale blue sky, the world spinning gently around them. It became their new ritual. Each morning the sneakers by the door, each afternoon the jump rope on the bed, but Amos had more to reveal. One evening, long after the house had settled into its usual nighttime hush, Nathan awoke to a soft scratching sound. He sat up, heart pounding, and saw Amos standing by the back door, his body tense, tail held stiff and straight. Nathan crept downstairs, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and opened the door without thinking. Amos slipped into the backyard, nose to the ground, moving with a frantic urgency that made Nathan's skin prickle with unease. He followed at a distance, barefoot in the dewy grass, watching as Amos circled a patch of earth near the old oak tree, paws churning up the soil with frantic, scraping motions. Nathan knelt beside him, brushing aside clumps of dirt, his fingers quickly becoming muddy and raw. Something metallic glinted under the thin layer of earth. He dug faster, hands trembling, until he unearthed a small, battered object. It was a collar, old and worn, the leather cracked with age, the buckle rusted nearly shut. Attached to it by a single, stubborn link was a tarnished nameplate. Nathan wiped it clean against his shirt, holding it up to the moonlight, and squinted at the inscription. One word had been engraved there, simple and profound: faith. Nathan stared at it, his breath catching painfully in his throat. He turned to Amos, who sat watching him with solemn eyes, his body quivering with the effort it had taken to dig through time and memory to bring this relic into the light. Faith, Nathan whispered, tasting the word, the weight of it settling in his chest. Was that your name? Amos whined softly, leaning in to nudge the collar with his nose, confirming what Nathan already knew deep in his bones. Faith. Not Amos, not the broken, discarded shell the shelter had written off, but Faith, the dog who had once sat beside a frightened little boy and taught him to trust the world again, even if only for a while. Tears blurred Nathan's vision as he clutched the collar to his chest, feeling the weight of all the lost years pressing down on him. Amos pressed closer, resting his head against Nathan's side, offering the same steadfast comfort he had given so long ago. Nathan whispered the name again, over and over, as if by speaking it he could stitch together the torn edges of both their souls. Faith. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves into a soft, whispering chorus. and somewhere deep in the earth, the roots of the old oak tree shivered and stretched toward the surface, reaching for the broken pieces of the past that refused to stay buried. The next morning, Nathan sat at the kitchen table, the old collar with the nameplate Faith lying between his trembling hands. His mother moved around the kitchen in a distracted haze, pouring coffee, flipping through unopened mail, but Nathan barely noticed. His mind was racing, each thought colliding with the next like frantic birds trapped against a windowpane. Faith. That had been his name, not a name heavy with meaning. A name tied to something bigger than either of them could understand yet. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more buried beneath the surface, more waiting to be unearthed. So, after breakfast, with his mother distracted by a long phone call, Nathan slipped upstairs, cradling the collar carefully against his chest, and booted up the dusty old laptop he rarely used anymore. He typed in the name of the therapy center from the faded badge he had found, fingers stumbling over the keys in his haste. The search results were sparse, most links broken or archived, but one small news article caught his eye. Tragic fire destroys Serenity Rehabilitation Center, one child hospitalized, therapy dogs lost. Nathan clicked it open, his pulse hammering in his ears. The article was brief, written in terse, clinical language. It detailed how a sudden electrical fire had broken out during a storm, how staff had evacuated the children first, but in the chaos, the therapy animals had been left behind. By the time firefighters arrived, most of the animals had already succumbed to smoke inhalation. Only one dog had been found alive, a German shepherd who had apparently resisted rescue attempts, barking and pacing frantically near the children's wing even as the flames spread. The article mentioned that after the incident, the dog was labeled aggressive and transferred to a government facility for further evaluation. No name was given, but Nathan knew. He knew in the marrow of his bones that the dog had been Faith. His Faith. Tears burned his eyes as he read and reread the short piece, piecing together the terrible night he had been too young to fully remember. Faith hadn't abandoned him. Faith had fought to save him, and for that bravery, for that unwavering loyalty, he had been punished, stripped of his name, tossed aside like damaged goods. Nathan scrolled down, scanning for any mention of familiar names, anything that might tether this ghost story to his own fractured past. Near the bottom, a name snagged his attention. Among those listed as volunteers who helped during the rescue effort was one David Matthews. His father. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the room tilting slightly around him. His father had been there. His father had tried to save Faith, but he had never spoken about it, never even hinted at it. Nathan staggered to his feet, clutching the edge of the desk for balance. He had to know more. Heart hammering, he rummaged through the battered filing cabinet in the corner of his mother's bedroom, where old documents and photographs were crammed together in no discernible order. At the very back, behind insurance papers and yellowed tax returns, he found a manila envelope labeled Serenity Center. Inside were photos brittle with age and a few crumpled reports. In one photo, Nathan's father stood beside a smoking wreckage, soot staining his uniform, a grim set to his jaw. He held a struggling, soot-backed German shepherd in his arms, Faith, whose wide, terrified eyes stared straight into the camera. In another, handwritten in his father's careful block script, were notes: dog resisted evacuation, kept returning to children's wing, injuries minor, recommended rehabilitation, request for adoption denied due to behavioral concerns. Nathan sat down hard on the floor, the envelope spilling its contents around him like broken pieces of a puzzle too painful to complete. His father had tried. He had seen Faith's loyalty, his courage, and had fought to bring him home. But the system had failed them both. Somewhere along the way, his father had been forced to give up, and the shame of that failure had been buried deep enough that even Nathan's mother had kept it hidden. Footsteps sounded behind him. He turned to see his mother standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hands twisting nervously in the hem of her sweater. She opened her mouth to speak, closed it again, then finally crossed the room to kneel beside him. She picked up one of the photographs, her fingers trembling. Nathan swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal rising in his throat. He tried to save him, he said, his voice breaking. He tried to save Faith. His mother nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "He loved that dog," she whispered. "He fought for him. But after the center closed, Faith was unstable, dangerous. They wouldn't let us adopt him. Your father fought, but they made it impossible. He carried that guilt until the day he died." Nathan pressed the old collar to his chest, the weight of it grounding him. "Why didn't you tell me?" She shook her head helplessly. "You were so young. You had already lost so much. I thought it would be kinder if you didn't remember." Nathan closed his eyes, the pain radiating outward like ripples across a pond. He remembered now. The fire, the fear, the way Faith had barked and tugged at his sleeve trying to pull him toward safety. He remembered being carried through smoke and darkness, the smell of burning plastic, the heat that seemed to scorch the very air from his lungs. And he remembered, dimly, the feel of fur against his cheek, the sound of a heart beating steadily beneath him. Faith had saved him, and he had forgotten. Nathan rose to his feet, Faith immediately rising beside him, ever watchful, ever steady. He turned to his mother, something fierce and unbreakable in his gaze. "We owe him," he said simply. "We owe him everything." She nodded, pressing her knuckles against her lips to stifle a sob. "I know," she whispered. Nathan bent to clip the old collar around Faith's neck, the tarnished nameplate gleaming dully in the morning light. Faith sat tall and proud, as if sensing the restoration of something vital, something true. Nathan rested his forehead against Faith's and whispered, "I remember you." Outside, the autumn wind stirred the fallen leaves into whirling dervishes, the old oak tree creaking under the weight of 1,000 unshed memories. Inside, Nathan Matthews and his Faith stood ready to face the long road still ahead. The days after the revelations about Faith passed in a kind of raw, tentative peace, as if the house itself needed time to absorb the weight of the uncovered truth. Nathan and Faith Amos moved through the hours with a new understanding between them, a deep, solemn bond that needed no words to reinforce. Nathan spent long afternoons sitting beneath the old oak tree in the backyard, Faith pressed against his side, both of them silent, healing in the simple rhythm of shared presence. But the world outside their fragile bubble continued to spin, and sometimes, life had a way of testing the threads of even the strongest bonds when least expected. The storm rolled in without warning one gray afternoon, a wall of black clouds swallowing the horizon, the wind rising in sudden howling gusts that rattled the windows and sent brittle leaves skittering down the streets like frightened birds. Nathan had gone out earlier to the edge of the woods behind their house, a place where he sometimes escaped when the walls felt too close, when the memories pressed too hard. Faith had barked once, sharply, as if warning him to stay close, but Nathan, still tangled in the lingering guilt over what had been lost and found, had waved him off with a promise to return soon. When the first heavy drops began to fall, his mother grew anxious, pacing the living room, glancing at the clock every few minutes. Faith stood by the back door, body taut with tension, ears swiveling toward the distant rumble of thunder. Minutes turned into an hour, and still no sign of Nathan. When the rain began lashing the house in horizontal sheets, his mother grabbed her coat, her face pale with worry, but Faith was faster. The dog barked once, sharp and commanding, then threw himself at the door, demanding to be let out. She hesitated only a second before flinging it open, and Faith shot into the storm without a backward glance. The forest was a nightmare of twisting shadows and waterlogged paths, the trees groaning under the force of the wind, the underbrush a treacherous maze of mud and fallen branches. Faith moved through it with grim determination, his nose low to the ground, his body hunched against the driving rain. His vision blurred on one side, the old injury from years ago now nearly rendered. He needed memory, instinct. The training burned into his bones long before the world had broken him. He moved in a pattern, the old search and rescue sequence his first handlers had taught him. Sweep left, scent, sweep right, scent, pause and listen. Despite the chaos around him, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind, Faith's body obeyed the old commands without hesitation, a muscle memory deeper than thought. He caught the faintest whiff of Nathan's scent on the wet air and angled into the thicket, paws churning through mud that sucked and pulled at his every step. Further into the woods, Nathan huddled under the broken remains of a fallen tree, shivering uncontrollably, his thin jacket soaked through, his fingers numb. He had tried to find his way back when the rain started, but the paths he knew so well had vanished into a swirling, disorienting blur. and every direction seemed the wrong one. He called out once or twice, but the storm devoured his voice, and he curled tighter into himself, fear pressing heavy against his ribs. He was slipping under, into that dangerous place where cold stopped hurting and began to feel like a lullaby, when he heard it, a single bark, sharp and insistent, slicing through the roar of the storm. He lifted his head, blinking against the rain, and saw a dark shape hurtling toward him, low to the ground, eyes blazing with a furious, desperate light. Faith reached him in seconds, circling once to check for injuries. Nathan tried to stand but stumbled, his legs useless beneath him. Faith barked again, a pattern Nathan recognized through the fog of cold and fear. 2 short bursts paused, 1 longer. "Follow me. Trust me." Nathan clutched at the dog's ruff, letting Faith's sturdy body guide him forward, step by agonizing step. Faith moved slowly, adjusting to Nathan's faltering pace, half supporting the boy's weight with his own battered frame. Every few feet he paused to bark the old signals, guiding them around fallen trees, across slippery ditches, back toward the faint glow of the town's distant streetlights. They were less than 100 yards from the house when disaster struck. A sharp crack rent the air as a branch, loosened by the storm, crashed down from above. Nathan cried out, but Faith moved faster than thought, throwing himself between Nathan and the falling debris. The branch glanced off Faith's shoulder with a sickening thud, sending him sprawling into the mud with a whimper that cut through Nathan more sharply than any blade. Nathan dropped beside him, sobbing, his hands fumbling to find purchase in the slick, bloodied fur. Faith struggled to rise, his legs buckling, but he forced himself upright, nudging Nathan toward the house with what strength remained. Together they staggered the final stretch, Nathan half carrying, half dragging the dog up the porch steps. His mother threw open the door at the sound of their arrival, her scream of horror muffled by the roar of the wind. She rushed forward, wrapping Nathan in one arm, steadying Faith with the other, dragging them both inside. The warmth of the house hit Nathan like a blow, and he collapsed onto the floor, Faith crumpling beside him in a heap of mud and blood and shuddering breath. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Faith, trembling, lifted his battered head and did something that broke Nathan's heart clean in two. He sat back on his haunches, stiff and formal despite the pain racking his body, and raised one paw slowly, deliberately, in the old gesture of salute, the same movement he had made in the shelter the first day Nathan found him again. The same movement burned into Nathan's soul as a symbol of loyalty, of love, of a promise never broken. Faith's paw hung in the air for a long, trembling second before collapsing against the floor. Nathan crawled forward, gathering the dog's massive head into his lap, sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. "You found me," he whispered. "You always find me." Faith's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, his eyes fluttering closed, the last traces of strength bleeding away like water through open fingers. Outside, the storm raged on, uncaring. Inside, boy and dog clung to each other, a fragile miracle carved against the inevitable dark. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of panic and desperate movement. Nathan's mother wrapped Faith in thick towels, her hands steady even though her face was a mask of terror, and somehow they bundled him into the back seat of the car. Nathan climbed in after him, never once releasing the dog's battered head from his lap, whispering broken promises against the matted fur. The drive to the nearest veterinary hospital felt endless, each bump and swerve a fresh agony. Faith lay frighteningly still, his breathing shallow, his body limp except for the occasional twitch of his paws. Nathan's mother ran every red light they encountered, horns blaring behind them. But she didn't stop, didn't slow down. When they skidded into the emergency parking lot, techs were already rushing out with a stretcher, barking rapid orders Nathan could barely process. They lifted Faith onto the stretcher, strapping him down gently but firmly, and rushed him inside, leaving Nathan standing trembling in the rain-soaked gravel, his hands hanging uselessly by his sides. Inside the sterile, blindingly white walls of the clinic, time seemed to collapse. A young vet with kind eyes and firm hands ushered them into a small waiting room. Nathan clutched the old collar with the nameplate Faith so tightly that the edges bit into his palms, grounding him against the rising tide of panic. An eternity later, the vet returned, wiping his hands on a cloth, He crouched before Nathan, leveling his gaze with the boy's wide, desperate eyes. "He's strong," the vet said quietly, "but he's badly hurt. Internal injuries. Severe blood loss. Truthfully, he's not expected to survive the night." The words fell like stones, heavy and cold, crushing the breath from Nathan's lungs. His mother put a hand on his shoulder, but he barely felt it. The vet continued, "Softer now. He's sleeping. If you want to sit with him, now's the time." Nathan nodded, unable to speak, and followed the vet down a narrow hallway to a dimly lit recovery room. Faith lay on a thin mattress, IV lines snaking into his front leg, oxygen tubing looped gently under his nose. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged movements, each breath a battle. Nathan knelt beside him without hesitation, pressing his forehead to the dog's side, feeling the faint, fluttering heartbeat against his skin. He whispered to him, nonsense words, old stories, fragments of lullabies his father used to sing, anything to tether Faith to this world a little longer. Hours passed, night deepened, nurses came and went, checking machines, adjusting lines. But Nathan never moved from Faith's side. His mother sat slumped in a corner chair, exhausted and silent. Around 3 a.m., one of the nurses tried gently to coax Nathan into resting, but he refused, curling tighter around Faith's, pouring all the fierce, aching love he had into the battered body pressed against, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. Faith's heartbeat, once stuttering and uneven, began to steady. His breathing deepened, slowed. The monitors, which had been shrieking intermittent alarms, settled into a quiet, rhythmic beeping. The vet returned at dawn, rubbing his eyes in disbelief as he checked the readings. "I don't understand," he muttered. "It's like he anchored himself to you, like your presence is keeping him here." Nathan stroked Faith's ears, his voice hoarse from a night spent pleading with the universe. "I'm not letting him go," he said simply. Word spread quickly through the small town, first among the clinic staff, then to the neighbors, then further, until by noon the story had made its way onto local news. The narrative was irresistible. The broken boy and the broken dog, lost and found across years and tragedy, clinging to each other against impossible odds. Donations began to pour in. First, a few dollars crumpled into envelopes dropped at the clinic front desk. Then larger sums transferred electronically as the story caught fire online. Local businesses offered matching funds. A retired vet tech volunteered to assist in recovery free of charge. The town mayor sent flowers and a handwritten note pledging support. Nathan barely noticed. His entire universe was narrowed to the slow, stubborn thud of Faith's heartbeat under his hand. The way the dog's paw would twitch occasionally as if reaching for something even in sleep. But his mother saw. She sat by the window of the recovery room, scrolling through her phone, her face flickering with emotions too complex to name. Messages poured in from strangers, offering prayers, offering hope. Parents who had lost children, veterans who had lost comrades, survivors of fires and floods and wars, all finding something in the story that resonated, that made them believe, if only for a little while, that love could still win. Late that night, after the second miraculous day of survival, the clinic's head surgeon pulled Nathan aside. "We think we can operate," she said, her voice cautious but hopeful. "It's risky, he's still weak, but with the funds raised, it's possible." Nathan didn't hesitate. "Do it," he said, gripping Faith's paw. "Please." Preparations began immediately. The clinic staff moved with brisk efficiency, fueled by the electric buzz of hope that now hung in the air like a living thing. As the surgical team prepped Faith for the operation, Nathan knelt beside him one last time before they wheeled him away. He pressed the battered old collar into the dog's chest and whispered, "Come back to me, Faith. Come back." Faith opened one eye just briefly, and Nathan could have sworn he saw the ghost of a smile in the dog's weary gaze. Surgical lights flickered on. The doors swung closed, and Nathan was left alone in the hallway, clutching the old collar, praying to gods he didn't believe in for just one more miracle. The hours dragged by in a haze of fluorescent light and the muffled sounds of machines ticking away time. Nathan sat curled in a hard plastic chair outside the operating room. Faith's old collar wrapped so tightly around his fingers that the metal edges bit into his skin. His mother sat nearby, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, offering silent support, but Nathan barely registered her presence. All his senses were tuned to the door at the end of the hall. the door behind which everything that mattered was happening. He didn't know how long he sat there, heart pounding in uneven rhythm against his ribs, before the surgeon finally emerged, her scrubs stained and her face drawn but smiling. "He's going to make it," she said simply, and for a long, stunned moment Nathan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then he was on his feet, the old collar clattering to the floor, and he was crying, laughing, shaking all at once as his mother pulled him into a fierce, trembling hug. The days that followed were a slow, cautious miracle. Faith still amious to the world, but faith in the secret corners of Nathan's heart recovered by inches, each small victory a celebration. He learned to walk again, first stumbling, then steady, his strength returning in careful, determined strides. Nathan never left his side, sleeping curled up on a cot in the clinic recovery room until finally, the vet declared him well enough to go home. The day they brought him back was golden and sharp, the air smelling of wet leaves and wood smoke. The town gathered along the sidewalks to cheer as Nathan and Faith rode in the back of a borrowed pickup truck, the old collar gleaming proudly around the dog's thick neck. People waved handmade signs, threw handfuls of confetti, and cried openly without shame. Nathan beamed, holding Faith close, feeling for the first time in what felt like forever that the world might just be good again. They settled back into a life that felt both brand new and achingly familiar. Faith followed Nathan from room to room like a shadow stitched to his heels, the silent guardian of a boy who no longer needed to hide from the world. Nathan returned to school, his steps lighter, his laughter easy, the weight on his chest eased by the steady presence of his dog waiting at the door each afternoon. They walked together every evening under the sprawling arms of the old oak tree, Faith's gait still a little stiff but growing stronger, more confident with each passing day. It was during one of these walks, just as the last light of the day was melting into a symphony of purples and golds, that Faith did something unexpected. Nathan sat cross-legged at the base of the tree, tossing small pebbles into the fading light, when Faith padded over, something clamped carefully in his mouth. He dropped it at Nathan's feet and sat back on his haunches, tail thumping gently against the ground. Nathan leaned forward, curious, and gasped. It was a ball. Not just any ball, it was small, faded, the once bright colors now muted and peeling. But Nathan recognized it instantly. It was the ball he had given Faith all those years ago during therapy sessions at Serenity Center. The toy he had insisted on leaving with the dog when the program was shut down, believing somehow that Faith would remember him through it. He had forgotten it, buried the memory under years of grief and survival, but Faith hadn't. He had kept it somehow, somewhere through the fire, through the years of loneliness and confusion, and now he had brought it back. Nathan picked up the ball with trembling fingers, turning it over and over in his hands, the rough texture anchoring him to a time when he had first learned what it meant to trust, to love without fear. Tears blurred his vision as he looked up at Faith, who watched him steadily, patiently, his eyes filled with a wisdom Nathan could barely comprehend. Nathan opened his mouth to speak, to thank him, to say all the things that burned behind his ribs. But no words came. None were needed. Faith leaned forward and nudged Nathan's hand with his nose, a soft, deliberate gesture. And in that moment, Nathan understood. It wasn't about the ball. It wasn't even about the memories, sharp and painful and beautiful as they were. It was about the feeling, the connection, the quiet, unwavering bond that had survived fire and loss and time itself. Nathan tucked the ball into his jacket pocket and leaned into Faith, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. They sat there for a long time, boy and dog, watching the sun slip below the horizon, the sky burning with all the colors of forgiveness and hope. Faith's body was warm against him, solid and real, and Nathan closed his eyes, letting the world fall away until there was only the steady thump of a heartbeat against his chest, the sure knowledge that he was no longer alone, that he had never truly been alone, not really. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Faith shifted, pressing his forehead gently against Nathan's in a gesture so full of quiet devotion that it stole the breath from Nathan's lungs. He understood now. Some love didn't need a perfect memory. It didn't need clear dates or detailed recollections. It lived in gestures, in laughter, in the silent spaces between two souls who had found their way back to each other despite everything. Nathan smiled, a soft, broken, beautiful thing, and whispered into the growing dark, "I remember you." Faith's tail thumped once against the earth, a quiet drumbeat of home, and as the first stars winked into existence overhead, Nathan and Faith stayed where they were, wrapped in the kind of love that didn't fade, didn't falter but endured, strong and sure, across every silence, every distance, every lost and found moment of a life still unfolding. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more stories that remind us what truly matters. What part of Nathan and Faith's journey moved you the most? Was there a moment that felt like it reached across the screen and found you? Tell us in the comments below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. After all, some bonds, just like some stories, deserve to be shared.